Hello, I'm Steve Maskery and welcome to Workshop Essentials. It's time to fit the new tail vise, and I'm going to reuse the hardware from my old one. The design is Tom Nelson's, and it's in Scott Landis's Workbench book. It consists of a steel frame with a wooden box around it. And there are two books that you really should read before you even think about cutting a piece of wood for a bench. The first one is the Landis book, and the second one is Chris Schwartz, Workbenches from Design and Theory to Construction and Use. And they're both packed with excellent information from people who really know what they're talking about. And Schwartz in particular is actually a very funny, very entertaining writer. I suggest you read both of these. And they haven't paid me to say that. I'm not on commission or anything. Really very recommended. Excellent. When you buy a screw kit, you get the screw itself, and it may or may not come with a handle. This has got a steel handle on it, but there might be a hole for a wooden handle that you make yourself, and a nut which fits on the screw. And you also get a split collar like that to hold the screw in place. But for this particular design, we need more than just that. So you need a bit of bespoke metalwork, and my friend Brian made this for me. You need a back plate, and that gets screwed to the bench like that. To the back plate gets bolted a piece of angle iron with a hole in it, which goes on like that. And then the nut from the kit gets bolted to that. So this is held in the right orientation then, in line with the vise. And the vise itself is a wooden box which is attached to two steel runners, and they run on the steel plate like that. So this is in place, and this goes into that groove and slides on there nicely. And you can see that in order to have enough room to screw this in place, I've blocked out the underside of my bench for this length here. But it needs to be enough to support the plate, but leaving a bit of the steel proud at the bottom so that the other slider can engage with the bottom edge of this plate. It has to be put in exactly the right place. So I have taken the existing dimensions off my old bench and recorded them on a pair of combination squares like this. So the first thing to do is to clamp this in place. So it goes somewhere like that. Like that. And then the height is recorded on this one like that. And then this end, that just needs to come up a tad. There we go. So the right distance from the end and the right distance from the top. And you can see now that because this overlaps the groove, it can slide in there nicely like that, which is what we want. Now I have actually had to make this groove a bit deeper. I did it on the table saw when we were preparing all the stock for the top, but it wasn't quite right, if I'm honest. So I've made it a little bit deeper, and I did that with my router while you weren't looking. Right, so the next job then is to screw this in place. So I need a centre hole, a pilot hole, and a waxed screw. There we go. Just got another 5 to do. Next it's the bracket, which goes like that somehow. And then that goes on there like that. Oh, go on, go on, go on, go on, go on. There we go. The wooden part of the tail vise consists of basically a box. This is open at the back. I'll show you when I assemble it for the final time. And the 2 steel plates that ride on that plate that's bolted to the bench, they're clamped top and bottom. The bolts, clearance hole in the bottom one, M8 hole in the top. So this slides backwards and forwards. Not as nice as I would like it. It needs a little bit of adjustment yet, but it will be all right by the time I've finished. I've fixed an MDF jaw to my bench with a couple of screws, and I've fixed this jaw, which will actually be part of the tail vise itself, to that with some double-sided tape. So that gives me the position when it's closed. The front part of the jaw of the vise is a big block. This is 3 pieces glued together, and that's going to go on there like that. But I've got to do 2 things before I can glue that in place. The first is to cut out for the dog holes on my table saw with the dado set, just as I did when I made the top. And the other thing that I've got to do, I've got to cut the front wall of this box back to be quite thin, only about 5 millimeters, because I've made life a little bit difficult for myself. These front dog holes, this front row here, is a little bit further away from the front edge than it was on my old bench. And I did that deliberately, because the others were just too close to the front edge of the bench. But that means that these have got to go back as well. And remember, there's a great big nut inside here, so there's a limit of how far back I can put this front wall of the core box. So there's as little clearance as I can get away with inside that box, which means that now it's all glued up and is sort of robust. I can cut most of this front portion away so that when that's glued on, these dog holes will be in line with these dog holes. So that's my next job. Cut that back, cut these dado holes, and I'll see you later. To reduce the thickness of the front wall of the vice box, I could have put the whole thing through the thicknesser. It would have been a perfectly okay way to do it. But I decided to do a triple resaw, 2 deep cuts on the table saw, leaving a narrow strip still connected, and then finished off by hand. Over this bracket and nut slides a core box onto which the rest of the vise is built. And I made it out of some of the offcuts, and it does fit over. But once the steel riders are clamped in place, it's too tight, and instead of sliding, it grips it. So I've had to make another one. And this, I've made the top and bottom a little bit slimmer, so there is more clearance. And this one works better. So that's going to go on there like that. And the steel plates clamp on top and below, and the rest of the jaw is going to be fixed to that. So the next job is to fix the jaw. Now I made this on the table saw using the same jig as I used to make all these other dog holes, and all this mahogany is reclaimed. This piece and this piece were my next door neighbour's double glazing, and he gave me the mahogany when they put plastic in, and it looks awful. But when it's cleaned up, look at this. Isn't it wonderful? And this piece, which is going to fill this gap here, this piece came from a panel of a door that was in the shack that stood on this spot before I built the workshop. There was a door in that corner, and it was mahogany painted this blue. So that'll clean up. It's a nice generous thickness, and that will go in there like that, covering the steel runner, and the whole thing will be, all flush and everything. So the first thing then is to glue this in place like that, so that it ends up flush with the top here, which is about 18 millimeters above this surface. Right, let's see what we've got, shall we? Oh, my clamp's stuck. There we go. And that looks pretty good, actually. That needs trimming flush. There's about 0.5 millimetre or so. And we can clean up the back, or the underside, I should say. Right, let's see this. That goes on there like that, and that goes there like that. Brilliant. Now it's time to fill the remaining gap. This is that blue board I showed you. It's not blue anymore. So that needs to go in there, but I need to get the thickness right and the width. So we can mark the width directly off it, like that. And the thickness, I want to excavate for this steel plate. So the thickness needs to go to the actual there, which is about 16 and a bit millimetres. So if I make that 18 millimetres, I can then plane it flush by hand. And it's about 20 at the moment. Right, so I need to clear this out of the way because I've got to excavate the underside of this to fit over that steel plate, and I need to do that on the router table. I've glued that cover piece in place, and that leaves me with a little pocket in there which fits over this top rider. That slides on the mounting plates like that, and this goes over the nuts and around the top rider like that. And I've discovered that it works best with a little tiny bit of clearance at the back, So we'll put a couple of shims in there. The bottom rider, this has got a very narrow groove in it as well, but we don't want the groove to make contact with the steel, not the bottom of the groove. So you've got to get it in exactly the right place, and it's only about 2.5 millimetres deep, so you haven't got a lot of wiggle room. But I've worked out that it's best with a couple of shims on that as well. So that goes on the bottom edge of the mounting plate. Now, getting the bolts in, this one's easy because I can see what I'm doing. I can actually see the holes and everything. So that goes up there and underneath. There we go. The other one's a little more difficult, but once you've got one in, at least you know that it's going to line up. You just have to sort of grovel about a little bit first. That's it. And then I have to tighten them up just the right amount. I don't want them loose because that makes the jaw sloppy and it sort of tilts over, which I don't want. But if I have it too tight, then the whole thing locks up solid. So there's a sweet spot for the bolts. And that is it. That's nice. I'm happy with that. Now, the hole in the end there is considerably larger than my screw. And that's because it's very difficult to get it in exactly the right place when you're building the thing. You can't mark through the nut, not very easily. I don't see how you can do that. So I've left a generous amount of clearance around there, which you might think is a bit sloppy, but in fact, it works really well. Oh, I've got a cap strip. Mustn't forget the cap strip. That's going to cover all this. And I've got a mixture of end grain and face grain, and it's all a bit of a mess. So that's going to go in there. And that's a 26mm hole, so there's very little clearance there. And then I can find the nut. It goes in. And then I can glue that to the end there, and there's almost no clearance, just enough clearance. And I've made it very slightly oversized so that I can trim the whole thing back and it'll be nice and flush. And then there's a couple of, there's a split collar which fits in the groove, screws it to that so that as the screw moves in and out, so does the jaw. So I'll get that lot put together and cleaned up, and then I'll show you the finished article. Well, the face cap is on. I've cleaned it up, beveled all the edges, and it looks rather good. I'm pleased with that. So I've got to put on the other half of the split collar, because that's what keeps the screw in place. Right. There we go. And that now goes very nicely indeed. Very pleased with that. Very pleased with that. I've screwed a cheek to the front here, and that's replaceable if it gets worn out. I don't think I've ever replaced the one on the old one, but I can do if it gets damaged. And the only thing that remains to do now is to get this top level. It's a bit proud, but actually in terms of its planarity, it's not bad. It is droopy a little bit, but not very much, considering I bet there's a millimetre difference over the width of the bench. And I can clean that up and get the thing properly flush right the way across. I mean, that bit actually, it's almost exactly the same. So, bit of planing work to do. Now, one thing I've not checked, I I didn't check whether I was getting the grain going the same way on both these pieces. So if one goes one way and one goes the other way, I'm going to be in trouble. We shall see. We shall see. That's the wrong way. That's the wrong way. See you in a bit. Well, that was a bit of a workout, actually. But it's now superb. That's nice and plainer wherever you look. Very good. And I've had to redo some of the chamfers. In fact, that one could do with a little bit more. Because I chamfered that to start with, so I could run off the end if I wanted to without getting breakouts. But of course, that removes the chamfer itself. So I've had to do that again, that's all right. The top itself has got a bit grubby in this because of all the mechanical stuff, steel and oil and whatnot. So I'm going to clean it all off with some thinners, and then I'm going to give it a couple of coats of boiled linseed oil to give it some protection in the future. I was going to paint the understructure, but I don't think I'm going to bother because I don't see it. All that stained wood, I don't see it, doesn't bother me, so I'm going to leave it as it is. But the top, and maybe the rest, depends if I've got enough oil actually, need a couple of coats of boiled linseed oil. And then that's it, the basic bench. I've got to fit some end pieces to my tool tray and make some dogs. And then the project is over. I can get rid of my old bench, cut it up for firewood and get this back where it belongs and get some space back into my workshop. I can't move. For some finishing touches, I've made a few accessories. So I've got some dogs that come in pairs like this, a fairly tall pair for thickish stuff, and a medium-sized pair, and then quite a shallow pair for thinner stock. And they allow me to clamp things between the tail vise and a fixed dog. So I can clamp like that. I can clamp like this. I can clamp. I can clamp. I can clamp. I can clamp anything, anywhere. The tool well, we'll see whether or not I actually like that, but it's very configurable. And all in all, I've really enjoyed this build, actually. One or two things have gone wrong, and I've had to do a couple of things twice, if I'm honest, but not very much. And it's ended up pretty much perfectly, actually. It's the best bench I've ever had by a country mile. It really is. So, if you've been watching along, thank you very much indeed. It's been great having your company. And I hope that it's given you some ideas that you can incorporate into your next bench. So if you've got a workshop, please enjoy it. I'll see you next time. Cheerio.